The largest invasion in history didn't begin with a massive airstrike. It began under skies already dominated by Allied aircraft. Hi, this is Ren at Libraero, and I'd like to take you on a journey with me to examine the history of the impact of aviation on D-Day. By the summer of 1944, the Western Allies controlled the most powerful air armada ever assembled. Over 11,000 operational aircraft, experienced bomber crews, mature navigation aids, and bombing doctrine refined through years of combat. Yet when planners finalized Operation Overlord, they deliberately chose not to open the invasion with a massive, high-altitude aerial bombardment of the Normandy beaches. This wasn't restraint, but strategic thinking. Heavy bomber accuracy above 12,000 feet was still measured in hundreds of meters, and forecast cloud cover and wind drift made precision against coastal fortifications unreliable, especially with landing troops close behind. But just as critically, air power was already committed to deception. Bomber streams, radar spoofing, and fighter activity were being used to reinforce Operation Fortitude, convincing German observers that the main invasion would fall at Pas de Calais. A concentrated, unmistakable air onslaught over Normandy risked collapsing that illusion at the worst possible moment. Instead, Allied planners employed air power as an integrated instrument, maintaining near-total air superiority, isolating the battlefield, suppressing German movement, and preserving tactical flexibility once troops were ashore. The decision protected the deception and the airspace, but it also left many coastal defenses intact, a trade-off paid for in blood on the beaches. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Allied air operations were already shaping German perceptions as much as they were shaping the battlefield. Bomber streams routinely flew toward the Pas de Calais, not to destroy targets, but to condition German radar operators and Luftwaffe controllers to expect the main effort there. On the night of the invasion, that illusion was reinforced from the air. Chaff, a cloud made of thin strips of aluminum, were dropped by aircraft, creating false radar returns that simulated entire bomber formations in phantom seaborne convoys, while small numbers of aircraft flew carefully scripted tracks to sell the deception. At the same time, real invasion airspace over Normandy was kept comparatively restrained, avoiding the kind of unmistakable, sustained bomber presence that would have immediately revealed Allied intent. Air power in this context was not about firepower alone. It was about information dominance, using aircraft to control what the enemy could see, track, and respond to, even as thousands of real sorties were already underway. Aerial deception extended well beyond bomber routing and radar manipulation. Across southern England, entire airfields were deliberately misrepresented to German and Axis reconnaissance. Dummy aircraft consisting of wooden fighters, fabric-covered bombers, and even painted shadows were positioned to suggest units that did not exist, while real squadrons were dispersed, camouflaged, or relocated at the last moment to reduce detectable concentrations. Ground traffic patterns, maintenance activity, and even airfield lighting were choreographed to sell the illusion of a massive air buildup opposite Pas de Calais. At sea and along the invasion corridors, smoke generators were used to obscure ports, assembly areas, and vulnerable movements from aerial observation, complicating German reconnaissance and targeting. Taken together, these measures ensured that German analysts interpreting reconnaissance photos and radar returns were never seeing the full picture, only the one Allied air planners wanted them to see. The effectiveness of this layered deception was reflected most clearly in the Luftwaffe's response, or rather its absence. By June 1944, German fighter strength in France was already degraded, but uncertainty over Allied intent compounded the problem. Aircraft were held back to defend the Pas de Calais, units were slow to redeploy, and command and control was fractured by conflicting radar reports and false sightings. When the invasion began, Luftwaffe reaction times were measured in hours, not minutes. Few fighters were airborne over Normandy at first light, and those that did appear encountered dense Allied patrols already established over the beaches and drop zones. The result was not a dramatic air battle, but an operational failure. German air power was neutralized not by attrition alone, but by misdirection and delay. That air dominance made the first Allied combat operations of D-Day possible hours before the seaborne landings even began. Just after midnight on June 6th, hundreds of transport aircraft crossed the Normandy coast at low altitude, carrying airborne troops tasked with seizing bridges, road junctions, and key terrain inland. C-47s flew predictable airspeeds and tightly timed routes, often in marginal weather and under sporadic flak, while Pathfinder aircraft went in ahead to mark drop zones with beacons and signal lights. It was a fundamentally aviation-driven operation, Navigation errors, aircraft spacing, aircrew discipline, and timing all directly shaped where paratroopers landed, and whether critical objectives could be taken before German forces could react. By the early hours of June 6, the air war over Normandy was already in motion. Transport aircraft inbound, gliders committed, fighters establishing patrols, and bombers were shaping the battle space beyond the beaches. What followed would not be a single air battle, but thousands of individual sorties flown by very different aircraft, each designed for a specific role within a tightly coordinated system. Understanding D-Day as an air power operation means understanding the machines that carried it out. The transport that delivered troops in darkness, the fighters that owned the airspace by dawn, and the strike aircraft tasked with supporting men already fighting on the ground. Before following the invasion into daylight, it's worth taking a moment to look at the aircraft themselves, and how American, British, and Canadian Air Forces approached the same problem with very different airframes and doctrines. As the invasion unfolded, Allied air power was carried out by a diverse mix of aircraft, each designed for a specific role within a larger system. British aircraft reflected both strategic bombing heritage and adaptation. Medium and heavy bombers like the Vickers Wellington, the Bristol Blenheim, and Short Stirling were used not only for bombing but for deception operations like Fortitude and Glimmer. Others, like the Halifax and Albemarle, were adapted into transport and glider tug roles, supporting airborne operations deep behind enemy lines. Gliders such as the Airspeed Horsa and the massive Hamilcar represented a uniquely British approach to precision delivery, capable of inserting troops and heavy equipment directly onto objectives, often within yards of their targets. American air operations emphasized scale and standardization. The B-26 Marauder carried out medium bombing and smoke-laying missions, while the C-47 Skytrain formed the backbone of airborne deployment, delivering paratroopers and towing gliders across multiple coordinated operations. The Waco CG-4 glider, though lighter than its British counterparts, extended that capability, carrying troops and equipment into contested landing zones where precision mattered more than protection. Together, these aircraft illustrate a central truth of D-Day air power. Success was not defined by any single platform, but by how each was integrated into a coordinated multi-layer operation. Almost absent from the skies that morning were the aircraft of the Luftwaffe. This was not due to a lack of capable airframes, but to a system already hollowed out by attrition and misdirection. German fighters were dispersed, held in reserve to counter an invasion that many still believed would fall elsewhere, while fuel shortages, degraded command and control, and Allied interdiction limited sortie generation. When Luftwaffe aircraft did appear over Normandy, they did so in ones and twos, isolated, fleeting, and operating without meaningful coordination or fighter cover. Their presence was symbolic rather than operational, a reminder that air power is not defined solely by performance or armament, but by the ability to mass, sustain, and control aircraft in time and space. As the airborne phase expanded toward dawn, glider operations added a different and in many ways more perilous dimension to Allied air power. American Waco CG-4A and British Airspeed Horsa gliders were towed across the channel by C-47s and Albemarles, flying slow, predictable profiles with no option to abort once released. For pilots and navigators, the margin for error was brutally thin. Release points had to be precise, airspeed tightly controlled, and landing zones identified in darkness or pre-dawn haze, often under fire. Over 150 Douglas Dakotas were used to carry paratroopers to around 6 different drop zones. These regiments were responsible for seizing bridges, small towns, and causeways leading into Utah Beach. Many accounts by 101st Airborne Reservists describe horrific conditions and experiences. Most commonly, however, was the shock experienced upon parachute deployment where weapons, equipment, and gear were torn off. One account from Gordon Walthall described, "When my chute popped open, I thought it was torn in half. I felt a wrench at my leg. When I looked down, my leg pack was gone. All I could see were tracers racing from every corner of every hedgerow and the boom of mortars and 88s on the field below. Some men narrowly missed being hit by their own planes and comrades." Ed Bocafoli described his experience. "I fell out. I slipped on vomit. Some guys were throwing up from nerves, and as we pivoted out, my feet went out from under me, and I went upside down." And from Jack Schlegel, "I recall that I was the last to leave the plane. The plane was going down. I moved as fast as I could to get out, and after bailing out, saw the plane go up in a ball of flame." British and Canadian glider troops, particularly those of the 6th Airborne Division, were tasked with coup de main assaults, landing within yards of their objectives to seize bridges intact, demanding near perfect execution from the air crews delivering them. Inside the gliders, paratroopers and infantry rode in silence, fully aware that once the tow cable was cut, the aircraft became a ballistic object, committed to whatever ground lay ahead. Many gliders crashed, splintered, or overshot their zones, but those that landed accurately delivered men and heavy equipment, including anti-tank guns, jeeps, and radios, exactly where parachutes could not, proving that air power on D-Day was not just about dominance of the sky, but about precision delivery under extreme conditions. By the time the airborne landings and glider assaults were unfolding inland, the German response from the air remained fragmented and delayed. Luftwaffe units closest to Normandy were slow to receive clear orders, while others were still positioned to defend an invasion that, according to German intelligence assessments, had not yet begun. Communications were disrupted, airfields were under intermittent attack, and the window for a coordinated response was already closing. When German fighters finally reached the invasion area, they encountered an airspace that was no longer contested, but controlled, layered with Allied patrols and governed by an operational tempo the Luftwaffe could not match. In that context, the appearance of German aircraft over the beaches did not represent a counteroffensive, but something far smaller and far more revealing. No formations or squadrons, but isolated fighters, arriving too late and alone, probing an airspace already controlled by the enemy. 2 aircraft over Normandy would come to symbolize the entire Luftwaffe response that morning, not as an attack, but as a fleeting interruption. Josef Priller's pass over the Normandy beaches was not planned as a counterattack. It was an opportunistic reaction in a sky already lost. In the early hours of June 6th, Priller, then commanding officer of Fighter Wing 26, was based in northern France with a unit already worn down by months of attrition. Fuel was limited, aircraft availability uneven, and pilot strength a fraction of what it had been even a year earlier. When reports of landings filtered in, confused, contradictory, and delayed, there was no standing Luftwaffe plan that could be executed at scale. Priller took off with a single wingman, Heinz Varderchik, flying FW-190s configured for low-level attack rather than air combat. Approaching the coast at high speed and extremely low altitude, they slipped beneath Allied radar coverage and avoided the dense fighter patrols ahead, not through tactical brilliance, but because Allied airspace control was focused higher up, where mass formations would have appeared. What they encountered instead was a scene almost impossible to process in real time. Beaches crowded with ships, landing craft, vehicles, and men stretching as far as the eye could see. The attack itself was necessarily brief. Priller made a single strafing pass, firing into the beach area before breaking away at full throttle. There was no loitering, no second run, no coordination with other aircraft, because none existed. To remain even seconds longer would have invited interception by the overwhelming Allied fighter presence that dominated the airspace above. From a pilot's perspective, it was an exercise in restraint as much as aggression. Deliver whatever effect you can, then survive. The significance of Priller's sortie lies not in its damage, which was negligible, but in what it represented. 2 fighters over Normandy were not the leading edge of a response. They were a reconnaissance in force by accident. For Allied troops, the sight of German aircraft briefly skimming the beaches was alarming but fleeting. For the Luftwaffe, it was a stark confirmation that the opportunity to contest the invasion from the air had already passed. Seen through an aviation lens, Priller's flight underscores a central truth of D-Day air power. Air superiority is not measured by bravery, aircraft performance, or isolated action, but by the ability to mass, coordinate, and sustain force. On June 6, the Allies could do all 3, though Luftwaffe could do none. The solemn story of D-Day cannot be overstated. Allied casualty estimates are as high as 9,000, with several others missing on D-Day alone. Some 4,000 airborne and glider troops were lost of the 23,400 deployed. As a mission, Operation Overlord was a success. The battle at Normandy was crucial in the recapture of Europe, but it came at a tremendous cost. The stories and lessons learned shall be passed on for generations to serve as a reminder of the price paid for freedom. Air power was but one component of this bold and critical operation. There are some incredible resources that have extensive information about D-Day and the detailed events that occurred. We would like to thank those who have done such excellent research over the decades that helped us to compile this information for you. We have included many of these in the description and encourage you to visit their sites and view their work. To learn more about the aircraft mentioned here and see the D-Day events unfold in a timeline, please come visit us at Libraero.com. All links mentioned in this video are included in the description. Thank you for your time and consideration, and we hope to see you again soon.